Hello everyone, welcome back to another chess lesson. So for this one, I wanted to talk about specifically the Maroczy Bind, and even more specific, mostly in the Sicilian defense. And so because the Sicilian defense is from the black perspective, I'm actually going to flip the board, just so it'll be a little easier for people playing the black side of this. So, of course, we all know the Sicilian is e4 and then c5. Now, I don't actually play this myself as part of my main repertoire, but I know a lot of very strong players who are friends of mine who have played this. And because I've watched so many of their games and because I play them so often, I've kind of picked up on some of the key ideas in this opening as a result of this. Now, with e4, c5, very popular, very common. Sometimes it can be very advanced, but this isn't necessarily the case. Now, in this opening, although this video I intend to be a little bit more on the introductory side, it can very well get very complicated. And especially when we talk about specifics in the Maroczy Bind and how to combat that specific pawn formation, it can get fairly complex, as with most things in the Sicilian. But if we go through this together, try and break it down and try and keep it as straightforward as possible, and we can work through it together. Okay, so after c5 here, very common, we would have knight f3 from a lot of players. And of course, black has many options. They can play e6, they can play d6, even knight out sometimes here is possible. There's many lines, of course. However, for this one, we will start with d6, as this is a very common way to play Sicilian. We get d4, we'll have c captures d4, and knight captures d4. And this is known as the Sicilian defense open variation. And what makes it open, of course, is the fact that we have traded pawns on d4 and the position is opening up already. So from a pawn structure perspective, we're going to have an open position and we're more likely to have a lot of tactics. Now, here comes the critical idea, because if black was to just do nothing and play kind of a logical developing thing, maybe they could play knight c6, maybe they could play something like queen c7, that's a thematic move in this Sicilian defense, maybe they could play g6 via and shadow, their bishop, try and get like a dragon set up. These are all okay in the sense that they're all Sicilian ideas, but it misses the mark on one key idea, and that is the idea that white has the option of playing pawn to c4. Now, let's just say hypothetically they play pawn to g6 here for black, which is missing the idea. I don't actually recommend this move unless you're aware of what you're actually walking into. It could be an okay move, but you should be aware that it walks into this idea. So the idea here is, of course, you're walking into pawn c4. And now in the Sicilian defense, this pawn formation here is what is known as the Maroczy Bind. Usually it has a knight on d4. Not always. Sometimes the square could be empty. Sometimes another piece like the queen could occupy the d4 square. But most often it is these two pawns on c4 and e4, and you have the knight on d4. Now, why is this setup so great for white, and why should it really be avoided for black? Like, what's really the problem here? Well, this is a very highly debated subject, very theoretical, and it's got a lot of tricky nuances to it. But in most lines, white just has a very slight nagging advantage, usually anywhere from like half a pawn to an entire full pawn ahead, if you check with an engine, based on what opening this comes from. And so most black players will just simply want to avoid this. They don't really want to walk into an opening where they're just slightly worse. And so if they could play any kind of way to prevent white from playing c4, play something else, they would probably prefer to play that just to not give white that extra option. So here the key move, if you want to avoid the Maroczy Bind, is to actually play knight out to f6. And this actually stops white from playing c4, because if white were to play c4 now, this move wouldn't really make sense here, as now this e4 pawn is attacked and we could just grab the free central pawn. And now black is completely better. They can always drop back if their knight is attacked, and they're simply up a pawn. So of course white is not going to do that. White is going to have to defend this pawn. And there's not really too many good moves that they can really play to defend this pawn. The most common by far is knight c3. And with knight c3, this is probably the best way to play here. But now, once they've played this, they have now blocked their c-pawn from advancing. And so they no longer have pawn to c4, and they can no longer get the pawns on c4 and e4 to get their desired Maroczy Bind structure. So if you want to avoid this, you play knight f6. Now, let's go back a bit here. So at this moment, I did mention that when we get, if we play something, we get this pawn to c4 here. So this structure, I say structure and not so much only Sicilian, because this can happen in many different openings. See, what makes pawn structures different is if it was an opening, like one particular variation, you can only get it with those exact moves. And this isn't exactly the same as transposing, because it could be a very different opening, but we can get this same setup. The 2 pawns on c4 and e4, and the knight on d4, and that can come up from many different openings itself. So I'll just go for like two or three examples here. So this could also happen instead of the Sicilian defense. I'll flip the board back to white, just so we kind of get another perspective here, since now we're more on the white side. Of course, if we were to look at the exact same thing we looked at, this is the same Sicilian line, just from the white perspective. And this is what you would play to prevent white from playing c4. And then you get like knight c3. If black were to play something like g6, now you can immediately play c4. This is the Maroczy Bind for the Sicilian. Now, if you were to play a different opening, like let's say they start with an English opening, play pawn to c4. Well, you can actually still get the same exact position in that same structure. Now, a very common way to play this are these opening moves here. And this is a very different opening as what we experienced earlier. But we will notice that after all these common moves, and these are all book moves, we will get to a very common position here. And notice that, again, we have this exact same structure where we have the pawns on c4 and e4. And this knight that's on f3 might actually end up going to the d4 square later in the game. So this is the exact same structure from this, it's a different opening, but it's the same setup, it's the same idea. Now, this is also not just e4 or c4. This can even happen from d4 openings. So we could look at a King's Indian defense position. So here we could develop a normal King's Indian type setup. This one I'll have the Zamish variation with f3. Castles, bishop e3, very common stuff. c5, all book stuff. Now we have knight g to e2. d5 is also playable, but there's no reason that you have to necessarily avoid this if you really wanted to or not, because it's also okay for white. It's just different. And here we have a very similar setup again. You have the pawns on c4 and e4, and in this case we also have a knight on d4 again. And so this structure is just slightly better again for white. Now, back to the original thing with Sicilian, but this is going to apply for all of those openings that we looked at. We have to ask ourselves, why is this slightly better for white? Of course, there's a lot of theoretical stuff, and I could, just tell you, oh, it's slightly better, move on. But I want to give you a little bit more detail than that. I want to get a little more in-depth, and then try and explain why is white slightly better here, and why is black actually wanting to avoid it in many lines. So the reason, first of all, that we should notice is white does have a very ever so slight lead in development. They do have a knight centralized. It is a pretty good, developed piece. And the other side has nothing developed. So black, it doesn't have anything. Maybe this is slightly better for white already. We also notice that from opening principles, white definitely has the center. White has a pretty good claim in the center. They have 2 pawns here. Black is slightly passive. Their pawn is only on d6. And white especially has a really good grip on this d5 square. And if we had not played c4, like if we had gone back, say if black had played like knight f6 to prevent this, in this position, it's fairly balanced looking, and we are controlling d5, and this knight does help, but it's only in a very minor way. We're only controlling it with 1 pawn, a piece is helping, but it's not like that's the main goal. Whereas if we were to go back, if we were to play the Sicilian, if we allow this Maroczy Bind in the Sicilian here, now we're not only controlling the d5 square this way, but even the c4 pawn is trying to control d5. And we still might get the knight to c3, again reinforcing the square. And so with the Maroczy Bind, we're really massively clamping down on the d5 square. So why are we trying to prevent anything from coming to d5 so severely? Well, because in the Sicilian defense, as with many of these common variations within this opening, oftentimes black will want to play this d5 pawn move, because without it, black is slightly cramped, they're slightly passive, and if they could play a d5 at some point, they could really open up their position and help claim some kind of space in the center. Now, if you have the Maroczy Bind set up with 2 pawns here, it becomes a lot less likely that the opponent can actually push d5 successfully. In some lines, they can actually get away with it and might actually be playable, but you're really deterring them from playing pawn to c4. And so from a white perspective, you just want to play it because it's just a slight advantage, and if you've studied it, there's no reason not to. Now, black, on the other hand, might have very good reason to want to avoid it, because why allow something if you don't have to allow it? And so, again, if we were to go back here, what I would recommend here is just play knight f6, with the simple idea that you're going to provoke knight c3, and then they won't be able to push this pawn. So those are some of my ideas here. I hope this short video helped with everyone. It feels like it's almost a short video just because it's the regular, one opening without me getting too in depth. And it feels like a regular concept to me, and I don't want it to sound super basic because I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible, but I also don't want to get overly deep because this can get very complicated. Some black players do study the Maroczy Bind, and they simply don't mind. And same thing with white. Some players for white also study this, and they don't mind. And so if you don't mind it and you have studied it, then by all means, you can allow it to be played. But for most players, it's got a reputation being slightly better for white. If we were to look at the other variations, it's anywhere from half a pawn to a full pawn, by the engine. In the King's Indian defense line, we can see here, just on the quick analysis, the engine's saying about plus half a pawn, little over half a pawn, 0.6, now we're 0.7, back to 0.6, somewhere in that ballpark. In this English opening variation with c4, it's almost a full pawn ahead. It's already 0.9, 0.8, right around that ballpark. I'm looking at the little deeper engine here, and it's actually almost plus one entire pawn already. So that's a pretty big advantage, and we're just, pretty early in the opening. And it's not just that as well. If we go to the Sicilian one, back with the Maroczy from the Sicilian, this is about half a pawn ahead already. And so you really don't want to be giving half a pawn to an entire pawn advantage, just after a few moves. And so the central control and the slight space advantage really shouldn't be underestimated. And so I guess the moral of the story is, if you're black in this position, I'll flip the board again. The key move you want to play is knight f6. That way you can help provoke this normal developing move knight c3, and then white no longer has the move c4. I hope everyone found this video useful, and I will see you in the next video.